So hi, I'd like to thank the organizers to give such space to sustainability. We'll talk about measuring the impacts of digital services, infrastructures, departments on both climate and the environment, which means our future. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Benoit Petit. I'm the founder of Hublot, a company we will briefly discuss just in a few slides. I'm also co-founder of a non-profit called boavista.org that works on open source tools, methodologies, and open data to help estimate the impacts of ICT on the environment. So you should all have heard about climate change, but what does it mean for our own lives? If we take the example of Europe, Météo France, the French weather agency, tells us that 2020 has been the hottest year ever recorded in Europe. If we stay on the same track, we could have up to 50 degrees in the summer, which is equivalent to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, if I'm not mistaken. And for the record, in France, we had a huge heat wave in 2003, and everybody reminds it in France because there were a lot of deaths, a lot of damages. And the maximum temperature we had was 44 degrees at that moment, and now we are talking about 50. If we remain on the same track in 2070, we could get regularly 50 degrees, not just in the summer. And that's more or less the case for all Europe, not just France. Of course, it's not just about temperatures, it's about chain reactions. Global warming has effects on water cycle. We have seen that with the recent floodings in Germany, in Belgium, in the south of France. We could also expect that some sea border cities disappear and food production to be harmed. And those consequences could be even harder in other places than Europe. So what happens when it's dangerous to live somewhere? People move, so you should expect tens of millions of people moving to the least impacted areas. You also surely know that global warming is due to two important greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, CO2, but also methane, nitrous oxide, to name the main ones. And CO2 is the one that's present in largest quantities in the atmosphere. It's essential to life, so that's not an issue to have CO2 in the atmosphere. The issue is if you have it in such large quantities that the capacity of the biosphere to absorb it and store it is not enough, then you have an imbalance and the climate warms up. So here you have the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere since 5,000 years, measured in part per million. So the huge anomaly on the right which is multiplying this concentration by 2 and more, basically it's us. The current concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is the highest since 2 million years. And the concentration of methane and nitrous oxide are the highest since at least 800,000 years. All those data are in the previous report of the IPCC, which is the World Experts Panel regarding climate. I don't know if you heard about that report. Many people in France didn't, because it was released the very same day Lionel Messi was transferred to the Paris Saint-Germain. So sad story. Now let's talk about digital, because we are here for that. Greenhouse gas emissions due to the digital industry are estimated between 2 and 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. The current trend could lead that number to 6 to 8% in 2025, which is basically tomorrow. But there are good news. Good news is that we do have our future in our hands. There is no good reason to blame the other industries, countries, or even our neighbors for that. We need a deep change in all industries to make things happen. And it's pretty simple. We need to shrink our greenhouse gas emissions to match the level of emissions that can be absorbed by the biosphere, which is called global carbon neutrality. And I insist on the word global, because a company can't be carbon neutral on its own. That's just not how it works. This global carbon neutrality now needs to be reached in 2035 to keep global warming under plus 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So we know that we have a huge impact on climate and the environment. We know that if we keep business as usual, it will lead us to a world that's violent, uncertain, dangerous, and hostile to human life. So why are we still so few to move? Why are we still so few to act? This is actually a classic of the games theory. That's called the prisoner's dilemma. Say you have two prisoners in two different rooms. They are accomplices of the same felony, and they are on an examination from the police. The rules are simple. If the two prisoners stay silent, they end up with 1 year of jail each. If the two prisoners betray each other, they end up with 2 years of jail each. If one prisoner betrays the other one, and the other one stays silent, the betrayed prisoner gets 3 years of jail, and the betrayer 0. So you see where I'm coming with this story. It's about the same with climate. Nobody wants to move. Everybody wants the other companies to do the move for them. But in the end, if nobody moves, we all win. And if we are only some to move, if nobody moves, we lose, of course. And if there is only some of us to move, we lose too. We have to move all together to win. But actually, we are kind of lucky, because in the case of ICT, the game doesn't look exactly like that. The rules are a bit different. Because in our case, to act means to measure the impact of our activities, reduce those impacts. Most of the time we talk about reducing the resources we consume for our services, reducing the number of machines we need, extending their lifetime, and so on. Watching to the impact of our services on user devices, that's a huge part. In the end, the game looks more like that for us. It's not a dilemma anymore, it's more like an evidence. Let's say you move and your competitors don't. You get better talent, attractiveness, and retention. You get better customers and user satisfaction, because most of the time when we talk about sustainability of digital services, we end up reducing latency, load times, and any technical metrics that have a deep impact on user experience. You can save IT costs, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. In the cloud, FinOps can be a friend, of course. Better resiliency, less dependency to your suppliers. Better security, because we do like to remove useless features that at some point become just backdoors to your systems. Better brand image. So in this case, you win. That's pretty simple. Now let's say that you move and your competitors move too. You still get better talents, attractiveness, and retention. You still get better customer satisfaction. You still save some IT costs. You still get better resiliency, better security, better brand image, and last but not least, we are saved. So in this case, we all win, and thank you for that. So let's talk briefly about Hublot. Hublot is a consulting and open source development company. We develop open source solutions to help evaluate and measure the impacts of ICT, tech services, and products on the environment. We also apply the SRE and DevOps methodologies to our work. Sometimes it's a great help. And we also assess and evaluate the impacts of IT departments, workplace devices, IT usages, and so on. We can also implement change management applied to IT teams and process. So let's have a closer look about the impacts. What are those emissions made of? We can split ICT in, let's say, 3 categories: users, networks, and data centers. You see that the biggest impact is by far the user devices, about 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to keep in mind that both as individuals and IT professionals, our first lever is to use our smartphones, laptops, screens, and other digital devices, as long as possible to fix them, buy second-hand instead of new devices, in the end, extend the lifetime of those devices as much as possible. We also know that the largest impact of those devices is their manufacturing. So we can say that the best device is the one you didn't buy new. And now, apart from greenhouse gas emissions and climate, and more about the environment, digital actually has impacts on many topics, not just greenhouse gas emissions. Here you have some examples: water consumption, metals and resources extraction and depletion, electricity consumption, energy, primary energy consumption. So this presentation is a bit more about greenhouse gas emissions and climate, but keep in mind that digital has impacts on many topics. And to assess those impacts, there is a methodology called LCA, Life Cycle Assessment, that has two main advantages. The first one is that it takes into account the full life cycle of an IT product or device, from material extractions up to recycling in the end of the life cycle, including, of course, usage, transport, manufacturing. And the second important point is that that methodology allows you to have a view of the impacts of your service or product on the criteria I've presented before, and you could also have assessment on the impact on other topics too. So that's really important because it allows to avoid pollution shift, because you could improve stuff on CO2, on the CO2 topic, but you couldn't make it worse on material extraction, for example. Let's say you buy new devices that consume less power, yes, but you bought maybe many devices and you made things worse regarding material extraction, for example. As we have said before, user devices have the largest impact. So we could think that digital services and infrastructures are less important. That's not that true. Here we have a comparison between the number of smartphones sold in the world every year and the numbers of servers installed every year. For smartphones, we are at 1.5 billion smartphones every year and more about 20 million servers every year. The scales are totally different, but even so, the total impact of networks and data centers, summed up from the data I showed you before, is about 56% of the electricity consumption of the digital industry, 37% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and 40% of the primary energy consumed by the digital industry. So we, as IT professionals, also have a role to play in the way our services are designed and operated. Let's get to carbon assessment methodology. Most of the time when we assess the carbon footprints, we consider three different scopes. The first one is about direct emissions, which usually means burning fossil fuels locally. Like I use my car, I'm in scope 1, to summarize. Scope 2 is about indirect emissions, which usually means consuming final energy. Electricity is a final energy because it's not collected as such in nature. It's produced from a primary energy with some technique. And depending on that technique and that primary source of energy, we could emit more or less greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And scope 3 emissions, it's all the rest of the emissions, which means it could be a lot of things. The most important ones are, regarding ICT, are the manufacturing of devices most of the time. Manufacturing of devices, servers, everything that's related to the digital services and workplace. And sadly, this scope, the scope 3, is often overlooked by companies who are reporting their carbon emissions. Most of the time, it's getting better and better, but still you can find carbon assessments that don't include the scope 3. It's very sad because in a lot of cases, it's the most important one. So one could say this can be tempting to forget it because it will cut a fair share of a company's carbon emissions report. So using this convention, let's see what are the emissions of a data center. You have scope 1 in green, scope 2 in yellow, scope 3 in blue. Scope 1, as we said, it's burning fossil fuels locally. So for a data center, it's more, that's not the only thing, but maybe the main thing is the fuel tank that we use to burn, to create electricity when there is no, when there is a power surge or an incident. About scope 2, it's pretty simple. It's all elements that are consuming electricity. So it's ICT, it's IT, servers, storage, networks, of course, but it's also cooling, lighting, everything that needs electricity in the data center. And about scope 3 in blue, basically it's everything, because everything has been manufactured at some point, including the building itself. So that seen like that, it seems pretty simple. And so at Hublot, we try to provide solutions to assess the different parts of this impact, because you've seen it's pretty complex. And one software we have developed is called SCAPHANDRE, and it's an agent you can install on your IT servers to measure power consumption of your machines and of your applications running on your machines. I won't have the time to go into details into this. This is a list of softwares, data sources you could use to assess your IT carbon footprint regarding the 3 scopes. And I let you look at the slides afterwards if you want those links and references. A brief word about SCAPHANDRE. So as I said, it's a software to measure the power consumption of your servers. It's open source. It's on GitHub. You can do whatever you want with it. It's an Apache 2 license. And it can allow you to build dashboards that will allow you to track your power consumption. But that's not all of it. For example, the BBC recently released a blog post about their usage of SCAPHANDRE in their private cloud. They use it to show the users of their private cloud carbon emissions metrics regarding their usage and their impact to put them in the topic and to make everyone responsible of the whole impact of the private cloud. So I encourage you to go see the blog post, which is very, very interesting. They explain everything about how they did it, from power consumption measurements up to carbon emissions translation. And they are very clear on the limits of their, let's say, proof of concept. So it's a very, very good blog post. So what could you do to jump on that topic and to act in your company? There are many options. You could, of course, contact Hublot if you want us to work with you. But there are also other options. You could directly use our open source solutions that are systematically on GitHub. Everything we do is open source. As I said, I'm also co-founder of a non-profit called Boa Vista that works on those topics and publishes not only open source software, but also open data and methodologies. So you can also contribute to those projects directly on GitHub or by contacting us. And I encourage you to go see the resources we have already released in Boa Vista. There is a blog post about measuring the impacts of servers manufacturing, which is a huge topic because it's maybe one of the toughest topics regarding regarding impact assessment, and not only carbon. That's what's interesting. And we are also building a multi-criteria impact API that you can embed in any application to assess the impact of this application. This will be on GitHub once we have decided a few things, but this will be open source, of course, too. and you can join us to work on those projects. Thanks a lot.